Well, it is 12:01 according to my clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I'd like to wish you a good afternoon and certainly appreciate you joining us today for Ask the HR Expert, Joanna Forbes. I'm Steve Schillig, the moderator, the director of the Small Business Development Center, headquartered at Kent State University, Tuscarawas. And for those that aren't aware of the SBDC, we provide confidential, no-charge consulting. We have a host of specialized counselors with backgrounds in food service, marketing, leadership, finance and accounting, QuickBooks and bookkeeping, computer technology, and HR, which is what we are talking about today. So this is our first attempt at a session of this type. We appreciate your patience. I have muted everyone for our speakers' benefit. If you have questions, please use the chat room. The chat room can be found in the ribbon below your screen. It is to the left of the phone. If you hover over with your mouse, you'll read Show Conversation. We'll do our best to get to those questions in the chat room at the end of the presentation. We wanted to offer this workshop to provide some general background and information on the reopening, restarting phase for small businesses. This is obviously a very fluid and changing rapidly. I'm pleased to have on the call today Joanna Forbes. Joanna has 20 years of human resource experience in various industries, including healthcare, manufacturing, food and restaurant, service, and nonprofits. She is a certified HR professional with the Society of Human Resource Management. Joanna owns and serves as the chief HR consultant for Forbes Human Resources, a local HR consulting firm. But most importantly, she serves as an HR advisor for the Small Business Development Center, and we're glad to have her. This session is being recorded and will be available to you through our website probably sometime later today or tomorrow. The slides that you will be seeing today will be emailed to you at the conclusion of this session. Before we start, I would like to mention our next Ask the Expert session. On May 28th at 12 p.m., we will be hosting two food service experts, and they will cover the issues and challenges related to that industry. Mark your calendars now. Joanna will provide a brief presentation covering the most relevant topics facing businesses on the reopening, followed by responding to the submitted questions we received. And again, if time allows, we will answer other questions in the chat room. Joanna, through the SBDC, is available for direct assistance. So if you have specific questions that did not get answered or you need additional help, please contact me directly. My contact information will be seen on the provided on the last slide in her presentation. I'm looking for suggestions and recommendations on other topics or programs that would be relevant, so please send those as well. If any of our other consultants could be helpful, you feel free to connect with me. Our assistance is confidential, and again, no charge. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Joanna.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm excited to be here today. Our one technical difficulty that we already had is that Steve has to control the slides for me. So you're going to hear me say next slide when we get to that. So I'm going to start by saying next slide. And then we're going to go ahead and get started. Steve already covered this information. I just would like just to point out that the webinar is for informational purposes only. As Steve mentioned, this information is very fluid. It's changing daily. So the information we're going to talk about today is current as of today's date. But at the end, I'm going to talk about some references that I just would recommend that all businesses, particularly our small businesses that are on our call today, stay current on. Next slide, please. And here is our agenda for today. We're going to talk about some workplace safety. We're going to talk about the recall procedures. We're starting to recall our employees back. We're going to talk about some best practices for remote work, some business continuity planning, current guidelines for various industries, the FFCRA, the CARES Act, and what happens if we actually do have COVID in our workplace. Next slide, please. So the first thing I want to talk about today is I want us to think about is how has your workplace actually changed during this time and what changes will stay in place. We're hearing a lot on the news about how this will change the workplace permanently and what's going to go back to normal. So keep those things in mind as we're going through today of what you think will change, what's going to stay in place for your workplace, and what do we think will actually go back to normal, if ever go back to normal. We're definitely going to see some permanent changes that have come from the pandemic for sure. Next slide, please. So I just want to start off by saying, coming from our governor's office are the Responsible Restart Ohio, and these are our guiding principles. This is for all industries. So we need to protect the health of our employees, our customers, and their families. Today, we're going to focus mainly on the employees. Support the community efforts to control the spread, and lead in responsibly getting Ohio back to work. So for today's purpose, we're going to focus on what we need to do to keep our employees safe. Some of these posters I'm going to show today are all on coronavirus.ohio.gov, and we will mention that again as we go. Next slide. Again, this poster is on coronavirus.ohio.gov, but I want to point these out. These are the 5 protocols for all businesses. Number 1, require face coverings. We're going to dig a little deeper into that at the end of the presentation. Conduct those daily health assessments of your employees. Maintain that good hygiene, clean and sanitizing your workplace, and limit the capacity to meet the social distancing. Again, these are coming out of our governor's office. These are for all businesses. So we want to see all of our businesses make sure we're following these 5 protocols. And we'll get into the industry-specific posters here in a little bit. Next slide. So a little bit of HR 101, because today we're talking about this and how it pertains to our employees. So the 2 things, my 2 golden rules of HR, and probably all of my HR colleagues, is to be consistent and to always document everything. So in this case, we're going to focus on why we need to be consistent and document things as we go through COVID-19. Next slide. So workplace safety. As employers, we have the legal responsibility to ensure our workplaces are safe for our employees. This isn't something we have to do just to be nice or to be a good employer. We actually have a legal responsibility to do that. So we have to follow guidelines that are put into place. There are lawsuits every day for employees that sue their workplaces because they feel like they're working in an unsafe environment, whether it's a work hazard, a harassment issue, or so on. So we do have the legal responsibility to make sure our employees feel safe. Our employees and our customers are going to have fears coming back to work. So we need to prepare and communicate that safety is our top priority for our employees and also for those customers. We want to remind those customers why they chose you in the first place. Next slide. So some of those safety measures will be what are listed here on the slide, implementing those health screenings, developing an exposure response plan, your PPEs, your cleaning, and those physical distancing. These are all the things that we keep hearing about that are coming out of the governor's office and what we're seeing on the news every day. But most importantly, back to our golden rules of HR is the documenting and the consisting. When you train your employees on all of these safety measures when they're coming back to work, it needs to be documented. That is very important. Now, for some of us that maybe work in an office environment with 5 people, this documentation may be a 1-page document with 10 sentences. For some of us who work in healthcare or manufacturing, this is going to be quite different. You're going to see things quite differently. Or for those organizations that have to deal with the public, stores, that type of thing, especially food service, these are going to look a lot different. I think today the governor is going to speak about the restaurant business actually. So we're probably going to hear some things that pertain to that. So the key thing I want to remind you is to have documentation of these safety measures and how you trained your staff. Next slide, please. So as we start recalling our employees back to work, we need to think and plan how we're going to bring them back to work, and we need to have an organized and controlled approach. Having all of our employees just come back on the same day at the same time is going to be a little overwhelming and could possibly be unsafe. So we need to do this in an orderly fashion. Next slide. Now, from an HR standpoint, when we start thinking about recalling our employees, we need to phase these employees in a non-discriminatory way. We need to use some way to start bringing back your staff. If you're going to start bringing them back in waves, use seniority or something, again, that you can document, not just, willy-nilly having people come back that are maybe your best performers. You want to have some sort of documentation on who is coming back and why. Still consider work share and bringing people back on a reduced schedule. Create a plan for those employees that are in high-risk categories, people who already have health concerns or are of a certain age. Consider allowing them to work from home or leave until they feel comfortable to return. I want to stop here for a minute because this says feel comfortable to return. Now, some of us as employers are thinking, I need to get my business back to work. I need to get the staff back. I can't wait forever until people feel, quote, comfortable to return. The one thing I just want to remind our employers on the call today is the Department of Labor has been pretty vocal about the fact that this is not the time to draw hard lines in the sand with your employees. This is the time to use a collaborative approach, to talk to your employees, to explain to them the safety procedures that you have in place, and to train them properly and to come up with a nice plan that shows exactly what you're doing to keep them safe. So yes, you do have to bring your business back, but yes, you do want to make sure that you're also thinking about your employees. Even though the dates have been set and have even passed as soon as the 4th, we still need to think about that. So we need to determine those increased measures to protect them when they're working on site, including isolated workstations, any additional PPE as requested that you can, and fewer days in the office. So again, every industry, every business, every office is going to be different. You need to do what's best for you, but also keeping in mind the employees. The Department of Labor has been very vocal about that. And also part of our recall procedures is that we have to notify the ODJFS of employees that are recalled to work. This is a state requirement and will help save on your unemployment taxes. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later because we have had a lot of concerns from employers who are saying their employees do not want to return. So we're going to talk about how to handle that. Next slide, please. So some other things that you want to think about while your employees were off. Was there anything that was owed to your employees while they were off? Were they supposed to get a pay rate? Were some employees going to be changing now from full-time to part-time, from hourly to salary, or vice versa? Were there any bonuses that somebody was supposed to get while they were off? Will hazard pay be offered or revoked? Now, things like hazard pay and bonuses are not regulated by the Department of Labor, but let's think back to our golden rules of HR: consistency and documentation. Organizations such as Sheets has offered, I think, an extra $3 an hour hazard pay for their employees. So again, we would need documentation of who and why we offered hazard pay to certain staff, and then why we stopped it or why we continued it. So again, it's your documentation. Next slide. Okay, let's talk for a little bit about working from home, because this has been, of course, very popular for a lot of us who can work from home. Now, for some of us, the essential staff workers, this has not been an issue at all. But let's just talk for a couple minutes about working from home and what this actually means. When I talked right in the beginning of this presentation, I said, how will your business change once this is over, or as we're moving towards the end, hopefully, which is soon? And the one thing is this working from home, because a lot of our employees have proven that they can work from home just as productively as they can in the office. Some people can and some people can't. That's the reality of it. So this will probably come up again as you're managing your employees. So just some actions to consider. are continuing to allow your employees to work remotely as long as they can. Now, even though we do have return dates, it would be very nice if you could continue that as long as you can. Staggering weeks in the office at home among your team members, part-time people working remotely or coming back, part-time in the office, part-time at home, things like that. Making sure they have all of the technology that they need to work from home. And, some businesses, and it may not affect anybody on this call today, but some businesses may see this as something that they can do for the long term. It definitely can help with work-life balance for some people. So if it's proven that it worked for some of your staff, this may be something that continues. Next slide, please. If you do have people that are working from home, I highly suggest you have a policy. And here are some things that you want to have in there. And this would be even if we weren't going through something like COVID-19. Do not promise a definitive date to return to the office or a termination of the telework policy due to general uncertainty of everything that's going on. So don't say by July 1st, everybody will be back. We don't know that. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what might change. Definitely include a clause that it may be discontinued at will and at any time. I recommend this on any remote work policy. If you have employees working from home, remind them that at any time that could change and they may have to come back into the office. Work performance should focus on the completion of objectives rather than on-time based performance. This is particularly important for your salaried employees, which we'll get to in a minute. Especially during this time. Again, this is not the time to be watching the clock and making sure employees are working that 40 hours or sitting in front of a screen for 40 hours. This is the time to focus on objectives. A lot of us are doing homeschooling with our kids right now while we're trying to work. And we're doing work at 8 o'clock at night because maybe during the day we were, teaching third grade math. So I know some people on the call probably know exactly what I'm talking about. So again, this is not the time to, say, I need you sitting in front of your computer from 8 to 4:30, because it's just not feasible right now with everything that's going on. Include expectations of the ability of your employees. So it is perfectly fine to say, I expect you to be able and available between these hours. I expect you to be able to respond to customers within an hour, those types of things. That's perfectly acceptable. I'm not saying that, people can not do their basic functions of their job. It's just we have to really focus on that flexibility. Next slide. So here's some things that I want you to keep in mind. Now, this is our Fair Labor Standards Act. These are all of the things that we have to follow. So our hourly employees are our non-exempt employees. You have to have a solid way that you're tracking their time while they're working from home. You have to ensure they're not working off the clock. Even checking emails is considered work. Sometimes that surprises people. So when you have employees that are checking their emails, you want to make sure they're not sitting and checking emails when they're off the clock. That will be considered work, and you should pay them for that. Think about lunch breaks. Anything that they do, breaks that are built in through their day. You want to make sure your employees are still taking those breaks. If they have a standard, for example, 8 to 4:30 shift with a half-hour unpaid lunch, ensure that your employees at home are not working through that lunch. Now, our salaried employees, our management employees, our professional, as they're called, employees, you can require that they're online during your business work hours. However, you cannot track their hours. That's a Fair Labor Standards Act requirement. You can establish goals and you can establish their expectations, but you cannot track work hours. You can only track their performance. And that goes without not just working from home. There's a lot about that working in the office as well. Next slide, please. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. The business continuity plans. For those of us on the call, you may have these already. Everything that's happened these last couple months have shown us whether or not we were prepared to get up and walk away from the office and close the door behind us, which a lot of us did, with not much notice. So employers have learned valuable lessons regarding their business continuity plans, or lack thereof, which is fine. So we learn as we go. So now's the time to review and revise those plans to prepare for future emergencies. Next slide. So what is a business continuity plan? Basically, it's a plan that your business will have in place to ensure that if there is some sort of emergency, man-made or natural, that you can get up and you can walk out of the office fairly quickly and still be able to do those essential functions of the job. So when we look up here on this slide, it says the plan ensures that personnel and assets are protected and can function quickly in the event of a disaster. So when we think about a business continuity plan, we look around our office when we're sitting at work or whichever our workplace is, and we think, what do I need to pick up and walk out of here with in order to continue working? And one main thing we think about a lot when it comes to HR is how can we pay our employees? If we had to shut down our plant today, how would we pay the 50 employees that work for us if we can't get back in the doors? So those are things that are definitely part of a business continuity plan. And everybody who does not have a business continuity plan that's on the call or maybe hasn't reviewed theirs in a while, I would like you to visit ready.gov and go to the Ready Business tab, the Business Continuity Planning Suite. That is what's recommended. That gives you the best tools to go on and work your business continuity plan. There's templates, there's videos, and it walks you step by step and gives you all of the reminders of the things that you would need to think about to have that business continuity plan. Again, this is something that the SBDC can certainly assist with if you wanted to contact Steve and talk about your business continuity plan. So next slide, please. Okay, in the beginning, we talked about the safety measures that we would need to train our staff on. And out of Governor DeWine's office, he came up, and I'm sure it's a team of people, came up with the Responsible Restart Ohio posters. And there's one for each industry. And I have a suspicion that today on his 2 o'clock call, he's going to release the one for the restaurant business as well, and hair salons and barbershops that we're all missing. So right now we have manufacturing, which if you follow this link, and everybody, again, as a reminder, everybody is going to get these slides. So if you haven't seen this already, if you follow the link on this slide, this will take you to the manufacturing, distribution, and construction Responsible Restart Ohio poster, which has your mandatory and your recommended guidelines for safety measures for your staff and for your visitors and for your guests. So next slide. This is the link for your general office environment, which was permitted to open up on May 4th. If you click on this link, that will take you to the Responsible Restart Ohio link for that as well. And next slide. And this is our consumer and retail services, which are going to open up on May 12th. So for those of us on the call that are in the consumer and retail business, if we click on this link here, that will pull up the poster and give you all of the guidelines from the state of Ohio that you would need to follow, the mandatory and the recommended guidelines that you would need to follow. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's the Family First Coronavirus Response Act poster. For those of you that don't have this hanging up in your office just yet, this is required to be hanging until December 31st. And you can find this poster, it looks like this here on the left of the slide, at that link. I'm going to go through this poster. There's a lot of information in the next upcoming slides. I'm not going to read it all. Again, you will be getting all of this information. Basically what I did was took this poster and just broke it down for you a little bit just so you could see the highlights a little better. Again, if you have any questions about the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, how this relates to your employees, please feel free to call the SBDC. Next slide. So who does this cover? This covers employers with less than 500 employees, which I think are probably most of us on the call today. Now, for those of us with less than 50 employees, which may be some of you on the call today as well, there is an exemption from this requirement to provide the leave due to school closings or childcare. Now, I just want to warn you that the exemption would be if it jeopardizes the viability of your business. So that would mean if you were to turn an employee down to take this leave of absence, and you would need to prove why this would jeopardize the viability of your business. You would need to have, again, the documentation to show why. Again, the Department of Labor is saying this is not the time to draw those hard lines. This is time to have a collaborative approach to work with your employees to do what's best for them and to do what's best for you. So the time period, this is effective till the end of December. And who is eligible for this leave of absence? It's all of your employees are covered for that 2 weeks of paid sick time, and your employees that have been employed with you for at least 30 days are eligible for that additional 10 weeks of paid family leave to take care of their children that are at home because of the schools being closed. Next slide. Okay, again, a lot of words on this slide, so I'm just going to point out the highlights. The 2 weeks of paid sick leave are at their regular rate if your employee actually has the symptoms or has been tested positive for COVID-19. They get 2 weeks of paid sick if they're taking care of somebody who has it, or if their children are at home because of the schools being closed. And they get an additional 10 weeks if it's home with their children because of a lack of child. Next slide, please. And here are just the reasons under this act that an employee qualifies for this paid sick leave. There's reasons 1 through 6 on the poster, and you can see them there. Next slide. So how long do we get for these employees to take off? Again, it's 2 weeks if they're sick, if they're taking care of somebody that's sick, or if they have a child at home. They get the additional 10 weeks, so for a total of 12 weeks of a paid sick leave if they're taking care of children at home because they can't go to school because the school's closed. I do want to point out, if these employees that you have working from home under this act are working from home, they do not qualify for this pay. They are getting a paycheck, so they will not be getting this pay. They will be getting their regular wages, of course, from their employer. So these are for employees who cannot work. So their job is a function where they of course cannot do it at home. Next slide, please. And I just want to point out, again, a lot of writing on this slide, but I just want to point that there are maximums. There are maximums to this. So for example, if we could just look at the third bullet for a minute. If you're taking off those 12 weeks to take care of your child because you cannot work from home and you are home with them, you would receive 2/3 of your regular rate, up to $200 a day for a maximum of $12,000. So there is a cap on all of these. Okay, next slide, please. Our CARES Act, the CARES Act has many, many components of it. The only thing I want to mention today that relates to your employees is, and of course, you're probably all well aware of this, but I just want to point it out, that the increased unemployment is an additional $600 a week from the federal government. It also provides an additional 13 weeks of unemployment benefits. This all goes through till December. Other things I want to point out to you are that plan administrators have the option to waive that 10% penalty to take money out of their IRA or their 401k retirement plan, and that there's also an increase on a loan that employees can take from their retirement plan if the plan administrator permits that. So those are just some things that came out of the CARES Act that pertain to your employees. Okay, next slide. Okay, let's talk for a couple minutes about what we actually have to do if we have COVID-19 infection at the workplace in terms of our employees. Again, this poster is on coronavirus.ohio.gov, and you will see these 3 steps here. Next slide. And of course, they're following the CDC guidelines. What steps should we take when an employee tests positive for or is diagnosed with COVID-19? Of course, we need to isolate or quarantine that confirmed employee, and they'll be doing that at home. Address and isolate those employees working near an infected coworker, clean and disinfect your workplace, and notify your employees. These guidelines are on cdc.gov. All of the websites are at the end of this PowerPoint, so you will see them with more steps under each of these how to clean and disinfect, of course, being one of them. The one thing I want to point out, because I've seen this a lot, is notifying our employees. That does not mean telling employees which employee actually has COVID-19. That just means notifying employees that they've been in contact with somebody that has. Next slide, please. If you do have employees that are out because they've been infected with COVID-19, remember, we have to be supportive. Again, we're doing a collaborative approach. One thing, and this is a Fair Labor Standards Act issue, is we never contact employees who are out on a leave of absence about anything regarding work issues while they're recovering. And again, our Department of Labor is really encouraging our employers to be accommodating and flexible with our workers while they're out. Any sort of alternative work arrangements that we can make, any sort of alternative paid time off programs that we can offer, of course, in addition to the FFCRA that we already talked about. Another Department of Labor suggestion is if you have employees that are out and they exhaust all of their PTO, their paid time off, vacation plan, whatever it is that you offer, allow them to run a negative balance and replenish that balance when they come back to work. So the bottom line from the Department of Labor is to be flexible and to be accommodating to the best that you can. Next slide. So the EEOC, which is the organization of the federal government, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, if somebody does feel like they've been discriminated against in the workplace for whatever reason, I'm not even talking about COVID-19, it could be anything, that is the part of the Department of Labor that somebody would file a claim. So the EEOC is who sets our, what we can and what we can't do. So the EEOC has confirmed that during the COVID-19 pandemic, employers can do the following without violating the provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Rehabilitation Act, because this has kind of been a lot of things. What can we ask? What can we say? That comes up a lot. This is new territory for us, and it seems weird that we can ask our employees, what seems like to be a personal question. So we are allowed to ask our employees if they're experiencing symptoms of COVID-19. We are allowed to measure their body temperature. We are allowed to tell employees who become ill with symptoms to go home. We can require employees returning to work to provide a doctor's note stating that they're fit for duty. We can screen our job applicants for COVID-19 after making a job offer. And this is kind of a big one. We can actually withdraw a job offer when we need the applicant to start right away, but they tested positive for COVID-19. So I thought that was kind of interesting for the EEOC to make that statement. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to finish out today. We started getting a lot of questions over these last few weeks at the SBDC from a lot of clients, and I put them at the end of the program here. And this may answer a lot of things that maybe some of you on the call were thinking as well. Again, you're going to receive copies of all of this in the presentation. So can an employee file for a workers' compensation for COVID-19? This has been a hot topic issue. Again, this changes a lot. This has been a very fluid topic. The link that I have on here at the bottom of the paragraphs, the bwc.ohio.gov, the BWC, the Bureau of Workers' Compensation for Ohio, has a great PDF that I recommend that you look at, answering a lot of questions about workers' compensation. So can an employee file? Well, it depends on how you contract it and the nature of your occupation. So basically right now they're still looking at it on a case-by-case basis. Generally, communicable diseases like COVID are not workers' compensation claims, because who is to say where you actually contracted the disease? So however, if you work in a job that poses a special hazard or risk, then the BWC may allow your claim. So again, case-by-case basis, and I recommend that PDF on their page there. Next slide. What actions can we take if an employee is exhibiting flu-like or COVID-like symptoms but refuses to leave the workplace? So you have an employee and they're sick, but they're hiding out because they don't want to go home, right? So we want to take a collaborative approach. Again, we want to make them understand the reasons why them leaving is to just maintain the health and safety of the entire workplace. Remind them of the benefits that they have, that they won't be losing pay, those types of things. Unfortunately, if it gets to the point where you have an employee that still refuses to leave the workplace, you can consider explaining to them that they're now trespassing on private property and that you could call authorities. You do not want it to get to that. Lastly, if you have an employee that frankly refuses to do anything that you're asking of them, assuming that it's an ethical request, you could terminate the employee for insubordination. That, of course, should be a last resort. We don't want it to get that far. Next slide, please. Can we require an employee to notify the company if they've been exposed or have symptoms or have tested positive? Yes, absolutely. You can have your employees require that they have to let you know if they're starting to have symptoms or if they've been tested positive. Any employees who are suffering from symptoms should be directed to remain home until they're released by a medical provider. Absolutely. Next slide. Did it go to the next slide, Steve? There we go. Can we ask an employee to stay home or leave work if they exhibit the symptoms? Yes, you're permitted to ask them to seek medical attention and to get tested for COVID-19. The CDC states that employees who exhibit these symptoms during a pandemic should leave the workplace, and the EEOC is right on board with that. They're confirming that we can advise workers to go home. Next slide. We're hiring employees during this outbreak. What can we do? So for those of you who are actually out there hiring some employees, the EEOC has confirmed that you can screen all of your applicants for COVID-19. And like I mentioned before, the EEOC has also said that if you have an actual applicant that tests positive, you can then withdraw that job offer if your intent was to have them start right away. Next slide. Thank you. Can my employee refuse to come back to work? This is the biggie. We're seeing this one a lot. So in most cases, no, but ultimately it'll be up to the state to decide on a case-by-case basis. When an employer recalls an employee to work, you have to notify the ODJFS of work made to that individual. This should stop the eligibility for benefits based on work not being available. So depending upon the circumstances, however, an individual may be unavailable for work. Okay, so you want them to come back to work, but why are they staying home? The most important thing is to have that conversation. Why don't you want to come back? Why are you staying home? If they're staying home because of childcare, then they may fall under the FFCRA, which we talked earlier. If they're not coming back just due to fear, then that's the time that you'll want to take that collaborative approach and see what you can work out with that employee. Explain to them all of the safety measures that are put in place, explain to them the training, maybe work and see if you can allow that employee to maybe stay home a little bit longer than you intended or some sort of flexible schedule. But if employer has any reason to believe an employee might refuse a recall for an unlawful reason, there is no other reason other than they would still like to collect that unemployment, then you may just want to, remind them of the consequences of that. Next slide, please. We're seeing this one a lot. Who's required to wear the face masks and what are the exceptions? So there are exceptions. There was a little pushback on that when they first came back and said that everybody needs to wear them. And then those are the exceptions listed there. It's not required to wear face coverings if there's health reasons with that employee, if it's against the documented industry best practice. It's a violation of your company's safety policy. It's not required if the employee is working alone in an enclosed workspace or if there's any practical reason why it cannot be worn. If you're working somewhere where that would hinder communication, which would cause a safety issue, then absolutely not. This is all on coronavirus.ohio.gov. Next slide, please. So we just want to, think about, how we're going to take care of our employees during this time. If you have an employee assistance program, it's a low-cost benefit. I always recommend businesses having an employee assistance program on hand. It is low cost. It's so minimal compared to health insurance. and I'm not saying in place of health insurance, but it is such a low cost compared to the health insurance. It's free counseling service for all of your employees. It kind of gets you out of being the middle person. Sometimes we act as counselors when we're trying to help our employees. I highly recommend it. Remind your employees of any telemedicine options that come with the health insurance plan, so they can continue to receive the health care that they need. And the financial wellness piece as well. Remind your employees of any advisors that your organization offers that come with the retirement plan, the 401k, the IRA. Remind them of the options that they have to take care of themselves during this time. Next slide, please. So I kind of went through today and talked a lot about the Department of Labor and the EEOC and why the Department of Labor is saying to be flexible. And here's why, because here are some things that we're going to start seeing. We're going to start seeing some lawsuits about wage and hour claims, unpaid overtime, failure to pay for that time worked. You know, I worked through my lunch while I was working at home and I never got paid for it. You know, I was working 60 hours a week at home, but I only put 40 on my time card. My supervisor was aware of that and didn't do anything about it. So those are some things that we're going to see, unfortunately. Recalls, you know, my coworker was recalled, but I wasn't. There's no reason why. I've worked there longer than him. Things like that. It's so important, again, when you're going through these things, to make sure you have your documentation and all your T's crossed and your I's dotted. So again, when you get these slides, look back at that Fair Labor Standards Act slide that I had about our employees and the working hours and making sure we're tracking it. The other thing we might see is retaliation claims under the FFCRA leaves. So for example, I take the 12 weeks off to care for my children. And then when I come back, maybe you change my shift. You give me the less desirable shift. You take $1 off of my pay, you know, things like that. So we may see some retaliation claims. In fact, we're already starting to see them. Just last night, I saw that an employee of Kroger, which we know is a large grocery chain, is already suing Kroger for reasons under the FFCRA because they're saying their leave wasn't approved. So we're already starting to see these things, and there's going to be so many that are coming up. Next slide, please. Just our final reminders today: continue to communicate and be mindful of your employees' concerns. Document all of that training. When you set up your training to all of the employees regarding their expectations for cleaning, responsibilities, the PPE expectations, have them sign off that they've been trained and continue to document. Have all of your required postings up. All of the ones that we talked about today, especially the FFCRA poster. Next slide, please. If you go to these websites, these are all of the resources that I use to get information from. The coronavirus.ohio.gov is very user-friendly. It keeps us updated on all of the mandatory and recommended guidelines for all of the industries. Again, if you have any questions, you know, feel free to call the SBDC when it comes to anything that we talked about today. Okay, next slide. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Steve. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I thought it was very helpful and beneficial information. So we did get a few questions in the chat room. If you have a couple minutes, I'll ask a couple. Then I'll suggest anybody that did not get their specific question answered to either email or call me, and we'll be sure to do our best in responding to those. So
absolutely,
in no particular order. When assessing employees' health and taking temperatures, is this done in a private setting, or who is doing this?
Okay, great question. This, I would recommend doing it in a private setting. There's actually recommendations right on the coronavirus.ohio.gov and the CDC, and I can get this for that person that asked. It gives great recommendations on how to protect the person that's taking the temperature and doing the checking, and what we should do for privacy. So there are guidelines out there.
Great. We're starting to get questions about taking a vacation out of the state. How should employers handle employees who voluntarily leave the state of Ohio and then return?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I do know that, what's permitted by the governors and the federal government will be the guidelines that as employers we have to follow. So we definitely can't tell our employees that they can't travel. But if it's still a recommended guideline, that would be something we'd have to look at. But we certainly can't tell our employees where they can go. But that's going to be an interesting one. I bet there's going to be more to come on that.
Thank you. As a small agency, can I be sued if my employee is diagnosed with COVID-19 and believes it is to be contracted through a work site? Sorry.
I get this question a lot, and it's not just about COVID-19. I get it a lot from all clients. Can I be sued if? And my response to that is we can always be sued, no matter what, for anything. That's the one thing is anybody can sue. So here's my recommendation, to that person asking that question. If you are sued, again, it all comes back to that documentation and that training. What are all of the things that you had put in place? You're going to want to prove that you followed all of those guidelines for your industry specific, and that the person was trained, and that it was done properly, and that it was documented. So if unfortunately you do find yourself in the case where somebody sues you for saying they got it from the workplace, that you're going to want to have those ducks in a row.
Great. I'm having trouble finding information on the health insurance credit employers can receive under the FFCRA. Any suggestions other than the IRS website on how to calculate the credit?
I'm just jotting this down. I don't know that off the top of my head, other than sometimes when you get on the IRS website, you do go down a rabbit hole of finding different things, and it's hard to find. So maybe Steve and I can look at that together and see if we can assist in that.
Okay, and I think this is the last one that's in the chat room so far, but if we have an employee diagnosed with COVID-19, what is the latest guidance on how long we should keep them from work?
Okay, it's still the 2 weeks. I have not heard differently than that, which is why the FFCRA has that paid 2 weeks off. So I have not heard differently than that.
Good. And if I can add to the question about taking the temperature, should employer have employees sign in each day? It was part of the private setting with taking a temperature. Do you want me to reread the whole thing, or?
Sign that they're agreeing to their temperature being taken? Or what was the signing for?
Let me start from the beginning. When assessing somebody's health and taking temperature, is this done in a private setting, and who is doing this? I think you addressed it. And then the second part of that question, should employer have employees sign in each day?
I don't think that's necessary. If I'm understanding the question, is it just to say that they're present, or that they're signing in saying that they are getting assessed might be what probably what that means. I would say, other than a general a posting that says, here's the assessments everybody's going to have every day. If everybody signs something, acknowledges once, knowing that indefinitely we're going to be having these screenings every day when we come to work, that would suffice. I would say you wouldn't need to have it signed every day.
Thank you. And I think we've covered the questions in the chat, but I would ask Joanna if you would talk quickly about your efforts, you and Sue Geiser's efforts on the checklist that will be available at some point for employers, especially in the restaurant, food service, and retail industry, please.
Okay, yes, for Restart Tusk?
Yes, but
okay. Yeah.
General checklist, won't it, for employers? Will it not be?
It is, and I would actually say that Sue, and I can tell she's muted right now, but Sue developed actually a wonderful checklist for the restaurant business that I'm assuming that maybe Sue could make available for SBDC clients. And and then those of us that are working on checklist have used the checklist that came out of the manufacturing, the magnet organization, which is a great checklist as well. And when we send out our email, maybe we can send a link to that.
Perfect. Sue, any comments before we?
Not really at this time. We were going to post it at the next webinar. I don't have it right in front of me at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I apologize. But
nope.
yes, there is certainly a checklist, and we're working together, Jeannie and I and the other few people in the group, to try and come up with a checklist that goes across the board for all restaurants.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, personally, Joanna, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time out, for all the research that you've done, for all the assistance you provided to the service areas that we cover through the SBDC at Kent State Tusk. Thank you very much. And again, I would recommend and remind anybody on this call that you are available on one-on-one assistance to answer any specific questions. And things are changing, so but getting a lot of positive comments, Joanna, so hopefully you're seeing those as well. And then just one last reminder, and that is May 28th at noon, Sue Geiser and Jeannie Keenan will be doing a Ask the Food Service Experts similar to this format, and hope that if it's not relevant to you, you'll share that information to anybody that it might be relevant to. So thank you very much. And I guess at this point, just a reminder that the slides will be sent out shortly, and this is being recorded. So if you want to get a recap sometime down the road, it will be available. Thank you.
Thank you.